On the morning of August 7th, 1974, as the sun began to break through the early morning fog over lower Manhattan, New York City was waking up to its usual chaotic hum. Commuters emerged from subway stations, taxicabs honked along Church Street, and construction workers gripped their coffee cups. But as people began looking up toward the sky, the city seemed to stop in its tracks. Standing 110 stories above the pavement, suspended on a 3/4-inch steel cable stretched across the void between the World Trade Center's twin towers, was a tiny silhouette. 1,350 feet in the air, a 24-year-old French street performer named Philippe Petit had just stepped off the edge of the South Tower into thin air. He carried no safety harness, no tether, and there was no net below. What the thousands of onlookers on the ground were witnessing was what would soon be called the artistic crime of the century. Before he ever stepped onto a cable between the Twin Towers, Philippe Petit was already a master of breaking the rules. Born in 1949 outside Paris to a French army pilot, Petit wasn't built for a classroom. In fact, by the time he hit 18, he'd been kicked out of 5 different schools. Forget traditional degrees. Petit taught himself magic, card tricks, bullfighting, fencing, and rock climbing. Then at 16, he found his real calling. He strung a simple rope between 2 trees in his parents' backyard and walked across. Petit wanted to turn public spaces into open-air theater. He took his craft directly to the people, working the sidewalks of Paris and Washington Square Park in New York, juggling and wire walking for crowds on the pavement. To go higher, he needed real engineering. Under Omenkowski's tutelage, Petit learned the brutal physics of high-wire rigging, how to anchor heavy steel cables against wind strain and extreme tension hundreds of feet in the air. The obsession started in 1966 in the most mundane place imaginable, a dentist's waiting room in France. 17-year-old Philippe Petit was flipping through a newspaper when he saw architectural sketches of 2 unbuilt skyscrapers planned for lower Manhattan, the Twin Towers. Right then and there, years before a single girder was locked into place, Petit made up his mind. He was going to string a wire across the gap between them. That single moment launched 6 years of obsessive planning, culminating in 8 months of boots-on-the-ground reconnaissance in New York City. He called the mission Le Coup. Before tackling Manhattan, Petit needed real-world test runs, and he didn't bother asking for permits. June 1971, he sneaks onto the roof of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, stringing a wire 223 feet off the ground while priests conduct mass far below. 2 years later, Sydney, Australia, he steps onto a cable rigged across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, suspended over roaring highway and boat traffic. These weren't just stunts, they were proof of concept. The street performer from France was officially ready for the biggest target in the world, New York City. Between late 1973 and mid-1974, Petit snuck into the World Trade Center complex over 200 times. He cycled through disguises like a spy, posing as a reporter for a French construction magazine, an architect, a contractor, even a delivery guy. When he accidentally stepped on a nail, he put on crutches. The guards didn't bother checking credentials for an injured man. He and photographer Jim Moore even rented a helicopter for aerial surveillance, taking structural photos of the roof decks to build a precise scale model back on the ground. Petit couldn't pull this off alone. He built an international underground network to back him. His French wingman, photographer Jean-Louis Blondeau, engineered the logistics and documented the plan. German juggler Francis Brunn bankrolled the operation. And in New York, they had an insider, Barry Greenhouse, who worked on the 82nd floor of the South Tower and handed over security passes and building intel. By the night of Tuesday, August 6, 1974, it was go time. Split into 2 teams, Petit and his crew carried over 500 pounds of heavy rigging gear, disguised as office furniture and delivery supplies, into both towers simultaneously. They took the freight elevator to the 104th floor of the South Tower. But disaster struck almost immediately. Petit and his team had taken the elevator up, hoping to reach their position unnoticed. But before they could continue, a guard stopped them. The elevator had been booked for workers from another company, and the guard refused to let them proceed. Petit and his team had to think fast. They explained, negotiated, and desperately tried to convince the guard that they had permission to be there. After several tense moments, the guard finally agreed and let them continue. They had no idea that just minutes later, Petit would step out onto the wire. Suspending a steel cable across a 138-foot void, a quarter mile up in the sky, presented a terrifying problem. The Twin Towers were designed to sway several feet in high winds. That constant movement meant unpredictable tension, wild cable whipping, and instant death for anyone standing on it. To get the cable across without triggering alarms, they went primitive. Jean-Louis Blondeau smuggled a bow and arrow onto the North Tower roof inside a cardboard blueprint tube. He aimed across the dark abyss and shot a thin monofilament fishing line straight to Petit on the South Tower. In the pitch-black night, Petit couldn't see where the line landed. His solution? He stripped naked and swept his body along the ledge until he felt the whisper of nylon thread brush against his bare skin. Finally, he found the arrow. That tiny fishing line was their lifeline. They used it to pull a thicker cord, then a heavy hemp rope, and finally the main walking surface, a 450-pound, custom-engineered galvanized steel cable. Then, near disaster. In the middle of the night, the massive cable slipped, plunging down into the darkness between the towers. It took hours of agonizing, back-breaking labor to haul hundreds of pounds of dead weight back up to the roof before the sun came up. To tame the wind, Petit rigged secondary support lines called cavaletti, anchoring the main cable back to the building facades to kill dangerous vibrations. For balance, he held a custom 26-foot, 45-pound steel pole engineered to drop his center of gravity below the wire itself. Dawn was breaking over New York. The rig was set. There was no safety net, no permit, and no turning back. Port Authority and NYPD officers scrambled to both rooftops, screaming at Petit to get off the wire. They even threatened to bring in a police helicopter to pluck him off. But Petit knew the truth. Downwash from helicopter rotors would blow him straight off the cable. He just laughed and taunted them, stepping toward the ledge as if to surrender, only to turn right back around and glide across the void again. Finally, after 3/4 of an hour, a soft rain began to fall, making the steel cable slick. With his point made and history written, Petit stepped onto the roof of the North Tower, laid down his balancing pole, and offered his wrists to the handcuffs. The moment his feet touched the roof, the cops slapped on the handcuffs. Petit was rushed off for a psychiatric evaluation before being booked for criminal trespassing and disorderly conduct. But how do you prosecute a guy who just gave New York the show of a lifetime? Nobody was hurt, nothing was damaged, and the public was utterly captivated. The district attorney made a deal. Drop all criminal charges if Petit agreed to perform a free high-wire show for local kids in Central Park. A few weeks later, he delivered, walking a cable stretched across Belvedere Lake. The Port Authority even handed him a lifetime pass to the Twin Towers observation deck, where he signed his name right onto a steel beam near the spot where he stepped off. Before August 1974, New Yorkers actually hated the Twin Towers. Critics called them cold, sterile monoliths that ruin the skyline. But by stepping into that empty air, Petit gave those giant steel boxes a soul. He turned a corporate construction site into a symbol of wonder. Petit never really left the city after that. He became the artist in residence at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine and wrote books on everything from knot tying to his high-wire memoirs. Decades later, the artistic crime of the century still captures our imagination, immortalized in the Oscar-winning documentary Man on Wire and Robert Zemeckis' feature film The Walk. Philippe Petit didn't just walk between two skyscrapers. He proved that with enough nerve, skill, and obsession, even the sky isn't the limit.